We've chosen the correct process. We've discovered the best process KPIs. We set excellent targets for those PKPIs. Job done? No, not yet. We've yet to answer a very important question. How do we get the data? Turns out that it's easy enough to devise PKPIs for which it's difficult, perhaps in practical terms impossible, to get reliable data in a sustainable way. Process performance analysis will always be dependent on access to high quality, timely, well-accepted raw performance data. If we don't have that, it doesn't matter how well designed our process KPIs and targets are. We still won't know how well the process is performing. In this video, I want to discuss an important and sometimes overlooked aspect of setting and using process KPIs. That is the practical collection of performance data. You've heard me say many times in these videos that the purpose of process is performance. So we've got lots of videos in this series about process KPIs and targets and frameworks and delivering value, because that's fundamental. That's the purpose of process-based management. And yet, good process performance management is one of the failure points of process-based management. And it's a big failure, because if we don't know what's going on, then we can't be doing any good. So here's the thing we need to be thinking of all the time. If we aren't measuring process performance, so we're not doing process management, and we wouldn't have a clue whether we're doing process improvement. How could we? And if we can't consistently collect reliable performance data, then we've got nothing. So the measurement method, the ability to collect the performance data, the raw performance data, is just as important as having the right KPIs for the right processes and the right targets for those KPIs. And let's be clear, nobody's interested in our opinion about current performance. We want the facts. Show me the data. We don't want to know what we think it might be, because we're going to make big decisions based on this analysis. So, we don't want opinion, we want fact. Show me the data. So I want to use 3 examples here of processes that we might want to manage and for which we'll need to collect performance data, just to illustrate perhaps a little more depth that we might need to go to be able to get reliable data, the right data at the right time without any argument. So let's imagine we wanted to do a customer satisfaction survey. Perhaps we run a coffee shop or something. We wanted to know whether people like what they're experiencing in our store. So we might have a KPI that's customer satisfaction. And we might say we want 98% of our customers to rate us at least 9 out of 10. That's the target. And we might write in the little cell that says how we're going to do that, we might say we'll run a customer survey. Okay, job done. No, not even close. Because what does that mean? What sort of survey? How are we going to do it? Is it face-to-face? Is it on the phone? Is it email? And do we have the phone numbers and the emails of enough people? Do we do it in store? Do we do it just one day, or we got to do it many different days? Perhaps we need to do it at various times spread out over a month. What is it we need to do to get realistic and statistically relevant data? How many responses do we need to get? It's not just a few. You can calculate this as well. If you know the total population and you can set up some confidence levels, then there's lots of free calculators around that will tell you how many responses you need for statistical significance. So it's got to be designed, isn't it? And even the questions that we're going to ask need to have some thought about them, because you could bias the survey entirely by doing by asking the wrong questions. So there's a lot of thought, a lot of design has got to go into it. And if it's important enough to us, perhaps we'd even get some specialist advice about that, because this is not trivial. So just saying we're doing a survey and collecting a bit of data, that doesn't tell us that it's going to be reliable data or that we could do it consistently. If we wanted to do it quarter by quarter, say, would it be comparable data? We need to think about all of that kind of thing. So here's another example, and this is broadly a project that I worked on. It was to do with the accounts payable process in an organisation, and it was inconsistent and generally just way too long. I was a supplier to this organisation, so I had a vested interest in the accounts payable process. Obviously, suppliers want it paid as quickly as possible, but perhaps even more importantly, paid consistently, not 30 days sometimes and 120 days other times for no good reason. So it sounds simple enough. We receive an invoice and then we know when we received it, and then we know when we've paid it. So the age of the invoice is simple arithmetic. Well, this was a very manual operation, surprisingly manual for a reasonably large organisation, but nevertheless, that's what it was. And we easily say we know when we received it. Well, we didn't. there was a date on the invoice, but we didn't know really when we received it in the organisation. And then we knew when it was ultimately paid, of course, because eventually it did get into a computer system and money was transferred. So we knew quite precisely the moment that happened. But we knew very little about what happened in between. So we could do something about establishing when we received it. It was a manual thing to do, but it needed to be noted. And then if all we wanted to do was say, okay, we'll then see when it got paid, then we can do it. So we've got that gap. But we knew that was going to be too long and inconsistent, so that didn't tell us enough. We wanted to know a lot more about what was happening in the various steps, the sub-processes through that. And we had no data about that at all. And it would go through several approval processes, steps, and it would sometimes go quickly and sometimes take a long time. So we had to think very deeply about how we were going to gather that data, because we couldn't do anything about shortening the whole time if we didn't know where the time was being consumed. And we couldn't do anything about the variability of payment unless we knew where the variability was coming in throughout that process. So we had to be very careful to think through what was happening and to take some example processes and then to build some reasonably manual processes to time check what was happening at various stages. So it was quite a complicated thing to actually design the mechanism to collect the data. And once we had the data, it was pretty easy to work with. But the hardest thing in that whole piece, that process improvement project, was actually designing the data collection mechanism, because it wasn't trivial. And ultimately there was an IT solution, of course, that made it easier, but it's still not entirely automated. There's lots of manual steps in there for approval steps. So the process itself didn't change dramatically. Obviously the time was reduced, not as much as the suppliers wanted, but as much as the organisation was prepared to do. But it became much more consistent, so most people were more or less happier. But that was a great example of a simple process, and you'd think it was easy enough to do, but there was very little data that we could work with, and it was hard to design the data collection mechanism. Let's imagine we're running, in the third example here, a laundry or dry cleaning service, and clearly on-time delivery is going to be important to our customers. They want to walk in at the time they expect it to be available and pick up their garments and leave as quickly as possible, and that's pretty reasonable. We would all have that expectation. So we would say then a process KPI for deliver personal dry cleaning services process, we'd say a process KPI is on-time delivery or on-time availability. And we might then set a target to say, 98% of garments were ready at the time expected by the customer. So that all sounds good. Now, though, we've got to collect some data. So we might know when it was ready, or maybe we don't care when it was ready. Maybe we care to note the times when it wasn't ready when the customer expected it. Because whether it got put on the rack ready for collection 1 hour before the customer arrived or 1 minute before the customer arrived, maybe we didn't care, not in terms of on-time delivery anyway. But now what we have to be careful of is, what is the customer expectation? Because did we say it would be ready at 4 o'clock, or did they have a conversation with someone at the counter when they dropped it off this morning and said, look, I'd really like it to be ready at 3:30 because I've got to go somewhere? And someone said, yeah, okay, we should be able to do that. But that time was lost. That's not even in the system. We're not even recording that. So let's imagine someone comes in and it's not ready. Does that actually get recorded? Not in any laundry or dry cleaning front counter I've ever been to. So you don't even have the data to say it wasn't ready. And what if we were collecting that data, okay, but maybe we were measuring when it got hung on the rack, but maybe then someone comes in and it's not quite ready, we're just packaging it up. Sorry, be with you in a moment. It's just here. I'm just doing it. Okay, thank you. Here it is. Done. Was that ready on time? No, it wasn't. Was it collected as a failure? No, it wasn't. So we need to think through the detail of all of that, because the details will be important, particularly if we're looking for times when things didn't work, because we would hope that doesn't happen very often. So the data is going to be pretty sparse. So if we're losing a lot of that data, then there's not a lot we can work with. And we'll be thinking that everything's terrific, but it's not quite as good as we think it is. So there are examples of processes that we want to analyze the performance and improve the performance, but we've got to think through how we're going to collect that data. So let's summarize all of that. Measurement methods, just as important as setting the right KPIs for the right process and then the right targets for those KPIs. So for every combination of process, KPI and target, we need to have a measurement method. And you might like to think about measurement methods using that 5 W's and a H tool, the who, what, where, when, and why, the 5 W's, and then the H is how. I might just use that as a bit of a prompt to say, let's drill down into the detail of how we're going to get this data. Because we need a very specific and tested method. And it's got to be, reliable. It's got to give us good data, and it's got to be repeatable and consistent. Because if we're going to be, tracking this on a weekly or daily or monthly basis, whatever it is, we want comparable data, don't we? We want to know what's changing. We might have made some improvements and we expect the performance to show up in that data. Well, it needs to be consistent, reliable data. Otherwise, we're going to be chasing our tail there with data that's not reflective of actual consistent performance. And of course, it's got to be easy enough to do. It's got to be cost effective. It's got to be sustainable. Because if it gets too hard to do, then we'll stop doing it. Or we'll just do it as quickly as we can. And then people will know that the data is not particularly reliable. So we start collecting it and we draw the graphs, but nobody believes in them. So what's the point? And if we're going to be doing good process management, which will allow us to do good process improvement, which is the point of process-based management, then it's fundamental that we're able to collect good, consistent, raw performance data right at the start.